Hello. Thank you for joining the Digital BC Livestream. Every month, we host a chat about all things digital. We look at topics from all around the world, and we have an international audience too. And today's topic is a bit closer to home. My name is Gen Lambert, and I'm the Chief Digital Officer for the province of BC. And I'm joining you from Victoria, BC. This is the land of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nation. I'm very grateful to live and work in such a beautiful place. I'll start off with a bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and we'll be posting it online for anyone to see. You can turn on live captions at the top of your screen under the ellipsis. And audience questions will drive the conversation. Please share your questions in the Q&A box and upvote the ones you like. So today we're talking about working in the open. And I'm joined by two of my own colleagues, Amy Kirtay and Annie Goodwin. And Annie and Amy work together in the Digital Investment Office here in the Digital Office. They've been developing BC's new Digital Code of Practice. And for those who don't know, our Digital Code of Practice is a set of best practices for designing, building, buying, and running technology and digital services in government. In short, the code tells us what good looks like. And Amy and Annie have been developing the code in a really interesting and innovative way. They are working in the open. And let's find out what that means. Welcome, Amy and Annie.
Thanks so much, Jen. Thanks. Happy to be here.
Okay, I'll kick off our conversation with a couple of questions, and then we'll see what's on the audience's mind. So first, I'll start with you, Annie. What does it mean to work in the open? And specifically, what did it mean for you in developing the Digital Code of Practice?
Thanks, Jen. I think of working in the open as showing people the work as it's being done. And I think this can look really different depending on your context. So depending on the culture of your organization, the project you're working on, and the partners you really want to share with. For us, within the development of the code, it really meant modeling the behaviors and the ways of working as we were writing about it. So working in the open is one of our practices within the code, and it was really important to our team to practice the practices as we developed the code. So in terms of what we actually did, we published our open draft internally for comment. So our internal draft had an open commenting feature where public servants could comment and engage with other comments from public servants so they could upvote and reply. We also shared our open draft on digital.gov with our external partners. So we received feedback on those practices from members of our vendor community, academia, and colleagues from other jurisdictions. Any changes that we made to our open draft, we recorded in a change log at the bottom of our practice. So this shows what we changed, why we changed it, and when we changed it. So those are the main ways that we worked in the open through the development and what it really meant for us.
That's great to hear about the comments on the comments. A little bit of debate on our best practices amongst ourselves. That's great. Okay, and Amy, what did you expect? And how did that match the reality when you first started taking this on in terms of working in the open?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Having not worked on an open policy initiative, I wasn't actually sure what to expect. Part of you hopes that people are going to care and that you're, maybe going to get a couple comments here and there, maybe from our leadership and a small group of folks that were really keen, which is what I've typically experienced with more traditional methods of policy development. But really cool things happen when you open everything up, and a lot of folks are really interested, and we got a lot of opinions. Some were great, some were personal, some were just general comments about like, hey, this is great work, really interested to see this. But then some were really in depth, and you can see the passion that came through from folks that was different than anything I had experienced. But one of the cool things that happens is when you ask for feedback and you get it, you actually owe it back to them to acknowledge the feedback and take that and do something with it. So as a result of that, it created a lot of relationship building opportunities. It allowed us to do a bunch of engagement, have conversations, and even push for further follow-ups and even support other groups that were kind of looking at this as a way that they could apply some of these best practices to the work that they do. And one of the interesting things that came about was that some folks didn't necessarily feel overly comfortable with sharing in the open. So while we were working in the open and encouraging feedback in the open, that requires a sense of vulnerability, both from ourselves and those that are providing comments. So I think it was an interesting way to see some of the courage that folks exhibited. It's a public service value. And so it was really fascinating to see that come through. And I didn't really anticipate that. And one of the things that I also didn't anticipate is we initially had numbers for our practices. So practice 1, practice 2, and it inadvertently created a hierarchy of the practices, which is not what we intended to do. We saw them all as equal. So once we started to get that feedback, we pulled the numbers and we just acknowledged that the practice is the practice and they are all equal and they're intended to be used together. And again, that's something I didn't really think about when we put them out with numbers.
Yeah, that's great. I know that often when there's a way to refer to something as a shortcut, we often will use it as well. So I think it forces us to talk about the whole practice and not refer to it by the number as well. Can you talk a little bit about how we got feedback from vendors as well? I know that we got feedback from them a bit differently, and how that played out.
Yeah, totally. So the vendor community is a huge part of, our broader ecosystem, and they need to really be able to have their say as well. So we made sure that we were reaching out to them, and having consultations with them, giving them a heads up. Thankfully, we were able to do this in conjunction with some of the work we did with the digital plan. So it was great to see just the engagement from them. They were all really keen. They recognized that this was actually going to impact them as well. So we made sure that we were able to go and meet them where they were at and provide them an opportunity to kind of say what they thought and how it might impact them. And I think that's a really important piece, because if we're going to be building things together, we need to make sure everyone has a common understanding. And I think through our vendor engagement, we were able to make sure that they were feeling heard and also offered an opportunity to co-design alongside with the BC Public Servant.
I think that really aligns to our new core policy as well. That's where we look to build in partnership with the private sector. That's great. Okay, Annie, a question for you. What really helped you take this challenge on?
That's a great question. And there's three, I think, specific pieces I'd like to speak to. And the first was really GDX being a huge support and a huge advocate for us. So we relied on GDX's engagement platform for our internal engagement site. We really couldn't have hosted the open comments and that discussion without that platform. They were incredibly supportive with setting up the site, answering all of our bumbly technical questions. And the site also gave us some fantastic analytics and insights as to what practices folks were visiting most often, when they were visiting, where they were visiting from. It was really cool to see the distribution across the province. The other part you really want to speak to were the colleagues across the BC Public Service, as well as members of our broader community. So, the vendors Amy was speaking to, our colleagues from other jurisdictions. I think the support of all of those contributors really helped us take the challenge on. They helped us amplify our messages, and they did such a good job of connecting us with other folks in their network that they thought would be a good fit for one of the practices or would have something to add. And then the last group that really helped us take this challenge on was the support of our leadership. So I feel, and I know the team feels, that really at every level, from director, ED, up to Gen support, we really did feel like we were encouraged to experiment and learn as we went. And there was a lot of recognition that this was the first time we had published an open draft like this and taken comments like this. And that leadership support was a big piece as well.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we have our first question from the audience. I'm not sure which one, Amy or Annie, if you want to take this one, but the question is, how do you see working in the open evolving as we continue to transform services?
I can kick us off here. So as Annie spoke about, we were using a GDX engagement tool, which was something that hadn't really been used before in this context. I think previously when folks have worked in the open, they've used other platforms like GitHub, which is fantastic. But I think for non-technical people, it can be a bit of a barrier, or maybe seem like it's not as accessible for those that maybe are not immersed in that kind of technical realm. So I think some of the tools that are allowed or afforded to us now actually enable us to work more broadly in the open, We have a lot of like platforms that enable us to do not only synchronous, but asynchronous engagement. And so I really see like the expansion of some of these tools and the way we use them as ways that we can continue to work in the open, and allows us to kind of try different things. And as we determine which tools are best for us to support services or services that are transforming with tools alongside them, we can test them out. And so it gives us an opportunity to really walk the talk. Annie, do you want to add anything?
That's awesome. I think the only other thing I would add to that is as we look to continue to transform these services, it's so important for us to model the ways of working and the culture and the skills that we want to see more of. So I think that really modeling what we want to see and showing that's it's not that bad, and sharing our lessons learned and sort of how it goes for us is also a huge piece as we continue to transform those services and figure out what this way of working means for us.
Uh-huh. Thanks, Amy. I think and Amy, I think this question that we got just now really relates to what you just said. Based on the observations and the byproducts of people not feeling comfortable working in the open, how do we plan to address and encourage working in the open going forward?
Yeah, sorry. That's a great question. I think you have to come from a place of vulnerability, and there's a little bit of discomfort around working in the open. It's not what comes natural to us, perhaps, and for some of us that have grown up in government, it's not what we were taught. Like we're taught to be a little more closed and make sure it's perfect before we put it out there. And so I think just the support of the team and just making everyone aware that we know we might not get it right, but we're trying to get it pretty close to right. And the best way to do that is to co-design it with folks and make sure that they have that opportunity. One of the other good practices around working in the open is like communicating, talking about it, telling folks. Like our networks are so enlightened in this space. And I think there's a lot of feedback that others can provide to kind of help you with that and help your, kind of dissipate that discomfort. So I think even just sharing the story, like us being here today and encouraging folks to also try it out is great. And, happy to chat with any other folks that have specific use cases or thoughts around how do I do this or how do I talk with my leadership? Like we've learned a lot along the way, and not to say that our way is the best way, but I think if others are able to kind of give it a go and learn from their quote unquote mistakes, they're going to go a lot further in making sure that we're designing programs and services for the citizen and the people at the heart of BC.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I think that iteration and learning as we go, and each time it tends to be better than the last time. So that's a great one. Is just learn by doing for sure. We also have another question that's sort of the flip side. Are there any risks or perceived risks to working in the open that you encountered, and maybe some risks that you considered as you were doing this? We can start with Amy.
Start with this one. Yeah, I think the biggest risk that we did talk about before we published the open draft, with people thinking that this open draft was the final draft and that this was it and there would never be any changes and here you go. So we were really clear with our engagement site as well as on digital.gov that, this is a current draft open for comment or feedback, I think is the word we used. But even with that disclaimer, people did think that this was it. So that was a huge risk. And we tried to make it clear, but we did still have folks think that government has published a new digital code of practice and it's done. I don't know, Amy, if you had any other risks that we came across or thought of. That was the big one, that people weren't going to understand that this wasn't the final product.
Mm-hmm. I think with our policy too, because it's a policy that every public servant should see themselves in, we touch on a lot of different topics. And some of these topics have subject matter experts that have been working in this space for a long time. And then here we are coming in with an open draft that we want feedback on, So I think for groups that have been more closed, it maybe perhaps seemed like we were stepping on toes or like we're starting to stray into other spaces that were perhaps not defined as ours. But I think, one of the benefits of being able to talk openly about it is like, no, like we want you included. We want you at the table. In fact, we would prefer that you provide your input. So I think, just to flip it, it's like it's not a risk that we're going to exclude you. It's actually like we want to make sure that you are included. And so I think there was a little bit of relationship building that we had to do around that to make sure that, like, as a BC government policy for all, we need to make sure that all are involved and all can see themselves in it. And that might mean that we're touching on spaces that stray outside of the digital office. But so long as I think we've got them included at the table and ensure that their voices are heard, I think it goes a long way to mitigating that risk.
Thanks, Amy. That's a really good point, and I think that kind of speaks to the vulnerability that you spoke about earlier. Is we're writing about things that we're not necessarily the experts on, and that can feel vulnerable for sure. It takes that public service courage that you mentioned. So the next question is around if it's better to communicate that it's okay to fail, particularly when working in the open, and how can we articulate that it's okay to fail? How can that be articulated across government?
I can jump in here. I think the way to articulate it is to say it and say it again, and again and again. And I can share and start with, a failure or like a mistake that we found in our workshops. That was, really humbling. I know for me personally, and really helped drive home how important accessibility is. We were running a in-person workshop around our practice around accessibility, and we completely forgot or missed or didn't even occur to us to ask if there were any accommodations that any of the participants needed to participate in the activity. We'd run it virtually a handful of times, and there was someone that couldn't fully participate in our accessibility workshop because we missed it. That's a mistake. That's a learning. It happens. It's okay. And I think sometimes that type of failure, for lack of a better word, really helps drive home the lesson. Like, I learned that lesson. Absolutely. And I happily share it with others. So hopefully that answers that. I think it's just saying it, being open about it, and continuing to say it and share it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the fail fast is interesting because in some ways we're not failing, we're just learning and we're developing. So I love the term, but it's hard to walk that talk and just know that there could be instances like Annie described where we really missed the mark. But that's okay because we will never miss the mark again because we learned a good lesson through that and we were able to continuously develop. So I think just being able to communicate that and support your colleagues. If you see them trying something new and maybe they missed the mark, like, I would much rather support that person so that they feel encouraged to continue trying than make them feel crappy for, what they did. So I think that's the other thing, is just making sure that we're supporting one another in this and knowing that we're trying something and we might miss the mark, but that's okay.
That's right. That's great. Yeah, and I think you're right that when we miss the mark, we remember that mark, and we probably won't miss that mark in exactly the same way. Again, we'll probably miss other marks, but it's a good way to learn, for sure. Okay. Next question is around how do you suggest starting a working in the open initiative? What's your first step? Maybe Amy?
Yeah. So I think there are probably going to be some areas of policy development or some of the work that we do where working in the open might not be appropriate. And I think there's an acknowledgement that, if we're dealing with sensitive information or personal information, maybe not the best place to be starting a working in the open initiative. But I think one of the first things to make sure is, like, executive support or leadership support is so important in this space. And if you have that, or you have a strong leader that's willing to support you, that's going to go a long way. Working in the open doesn't necessarily mean you're doing all of the things. It could mean just one thing. So it could mean just having an open demo to show what you're doing as part of your process development. It could be something as simple as doing week notes on Teams. So every week you're providing an update asynchronously. Like, there's lots of ways that you can start working in the open, and perhaps maybe you pick and choose a couple different tactics that you can employ. I would definitely say that making sure that people understand why we want to do it and the importance of it is also going to go a long way. And considering that this is a change for a lot of folks. So, perhaps employing even some change management methodology to making sure that folks feel comfortable with it. Because like I said earlier, it's not maybe natural for a lot of folks to work in this way. And so just making sure that they feel encouraged, because there's nothing worse than being forced to work in a way that doesn't feel aligned with the way that you necessarily would work. So just making sure that folks understand why and the importance of it and understanding the benefit of it in the long term.
That's great. Yeah, and there is an article that, or a blog post that Martha Edwards wrote, and that's in our latest Exchange Lab newsletter that suggests a few ways to start working in the open, some of which you've mentioned here. So that's great. Thanks, Amy. So this next question is around how you plan to deploy the open policy to other ministries and other BC government agencies. So maybe a question, if Annie, you want to take this one? And I think it relates to the digital code of practice itself and how that relates to core policy.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this is asking about the code of practice and what comes next for it. And so what we're looking at doing with the code of practice is launching it as a formal GCIO policy under core policy in the fall. And then really spending the next year looking at how we can be modeling the practices internally in the digital office, what that looks like for us, and how we can make sure that we're really advocating for these practices and showing them in action. And then also reaching out to our ministry partners and checking in around what these practices mean for them and what supports or help they might need to implement them as well.
That's great.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think a lot of ministries or even just organizations or places within our organization are actually probably doing a lot of this already. Like when we talk about working in the open or thinking about accessibility, like there's a lot of folks that are just doing this instinctively. So for them, it might not be much of a change. They might not experience much, but for other groups, it might be a little bit different. And so I think, to Annie's point, kind of understanding where we might need to add some additional supports and just understanding where people are and just making sure that we're available to support those that are maybe a little bit earlier in their journey, I think will be important to making sure that this really lands.
That's great. Thanks, Amy. And so next question that we got is, I think, a little bit back to risks and making sure that sensitive information doesn't get revealed when working in the open. So what are some ways to make sure that we don't do that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in for that one.
Great.
Yeah, so I think really being mindful about what you're sharing, why you're sharing it, and with whom. There may be information that's appropriate to be sharing with internal partners, folks from the ministries or potentially crown corporations, but may not be appropriate to share with the public. I think that still can be working with the open or working in the open. And then, really being mindful about the information we're sharing. So we may not need to share all of the details where it may speak to, cabinet confidence or personal information, but we may be able to share the type of decisions we're making or how we're working as a team or what our timelines are. And I think that information can still be really helpful and really useful to share. There's also, a handful of partners that can provide advice on, what we can share and with whom. So those would be our, ministry privacy officers and the information security officers as well would have, be able to speak to like specific information and provide advice there.
Yeah, that's great. We also have some great experts on that in government that can answer questions as well. So Annie, I'm going to sort of paraphrase one of our questions with one of the questions that we got from the audience. So what's hard or the hardest thing that you found about working in the open, and was that related to barriers that we have in government?
A really good question. We're still wrapping up the development, so I feel like there's going to be a really great retro and lessons learned when we're completely done development, but we're getting close. And I would say the biggest challenge, and maybe it was a barrier, is a little bit cultural. I think Amy spoke to this a little bit when she was talking about vulnerability. And, I think we did find in the development of the open draft that there were some folks or groups that maybe felt left out. They wanted a more traditional form of consultation or engagement. They didn't, want to participate in the open draft. And, we accepted any type of feedback, even if they, wanted to do it in their traditional way. Absolutely. Um, so that's how we navigated it. But I think that was the biggest barrier, a little bit of is ego, maybe is the right word, and expectations. And I did find that challenging, in terms of, navigating. Yeah, we tried to find compromises, and we would accepted feedback anyway anyone wanted to contribute. Um, but I did find that a challenge. Maybe it's more cultural, than like a physical barrier. I don't know, Amy, if you have anything to add.
I think, yeah, it's interesting because like when you start to think about new ways of working and employing, like kind of working in the open, some of our more traditional processes around like approvals or even like policy itself have maybe not caught up as much. So like trying to just even navigate this government system was a bit of a challenge at times. I don't know if it was necessarily a barrier, but and then also just like, yeah, just sitting with discomfort, I think, at times. And just, even something as simple as like, do we spell out AI every time we use it for the first time? Like little things like that, where it's like, I don't know, is someone going to call us on that if we don't do that? So like, just maybe even like there's personal barriers, but then there's systematic barriers. And I think the acknowledgement that sometimes they can come up in different places, and just kind of learning to work around them or over them or through them is a good approach. And it might look different for everyone in their context. So that's the other thing, is we're very lucky to have a very supportive leadership team. So that really helped. But if you're working in areas where there's other systematic barriers, it could make things a little more challenging. So
Yeah, and it's a really good point. I just wanted to add, I think our engagement site and the open comments felt really democratic. We had comments from co-op students and executive directors on the same practices, and they were engaging with each other on the discussion. And it is interesting. I think some people really liked that and found that really amazing to see and read and engage with. And it is interesting for some other people. I think it really didn't fit with their perception of that hierarchy. And I think that's something that's shifting, but it is still there.
Thank you both. That was a really in-depth answer. That was great. And I liked your point about ego, is we expected to get feedback and we wanted to get feedback in one way, which was very open, but not everybody was comfortable with that. So we needed to make sure that we're setting aside what we want, and making sure that we're accepting feedback in lots of different ways. So that's great. Okay, maybe to close it out, one quick question is maybe a yes or no with a little bit more. Do you think working in the open accelerates program or service delivery? Amy?
I gotta say yes. And I think when you're showing the thing as you're doing it, as we've learned, people just become familiar with it before you've even finished the thing. So I think it does accelerate it because it gives some insights sooner, and it allows us to learn more quickly from various challenges that we encounter. So I would say it does. Amy?
I would agree. Yes, I think it does. And I think for us, the way that we did it, it made it faster for us because all of our feedback is in one place, mostly. And we can organize it, sort it all in one place. We weren't managing multiple work streams. We were really just working in one place with everyone, which was huge for anyone that's ever tried to put together feedback on a significant policy.
That's great. And I think that wraps us up. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. So thank you so much, Amy and Annie, for joining me. And thanks to all of you for coming and asking such great questions. We got a lot today, and they were great to help us keep going and explore this area in depth. And don't worry, any questions we didn't answer today will be covered in our podcast. And you'll also get a quick survey from us at the end. And please take a moment to share your feedback. It helps us to adjust our approach and to choose future topics. So thank you, and bye for now.